finally to make an example of Vietnam, to indicate that countries that free themselves from Western domination and colonialism face severe and harsh conditions. It is hard to escape the conclusion that this is also the government's motivation in Nicaragua and Chile and Mozambique in the Middle East today. The continued war also created a post hoc justification for U.S. intervention, by then being able to point to the consequences of U.S. defeat for the assaulted nation. I love these articles that we read all the time now in the editorial pages about how it's better for Vietnam then under American rule than it is now. Given these policies, it is unthinkable that the Nixon-Kissinger team would have sought an early peace had they only been given a more docile or more peaceful population at home. We as a people assumed responsibility for the role of our government in Vietnam. The wonder of it all, in these times of benevolent reaction, of feeling free because one can choose one's TV station or one's health club, of carelessness about hunger and homelessness. The miracle is that an authentic, aroused, and engaged opposition grew and was sustained, a movement which was unable to stop or shorten the war, a movement whose revolutionary hopes gravely misjudged the period. It wasn't a revolutionary period. We thought it was for a moment in time. And so did a lot of people around the world at that moment. Yet a movement which remains, for all its limitations, an example of popular democratic activity that toppled two presidents and left behind a legacy that endures. The anti-war movement, some of it religious, some pacifist, some pragmatic, some anti-imperialist, some openly revolutionary, was united in its challenge to the Cold War basis of U.S. politics. The Third World, the small nations, were recognized as a viable part of the world community with legitimate rights to independence and self-determination. Vietnam marked the end of U.S. world hegemony, or domination, which it had enjoyed since the end of World War II. The domestic population and the rest of the world also realized that U.S. power was not invincible and that the power of technology is limited. Vietnam challenged racism and national chauvinism, which are fundamental still to the fabric of political and social life in the United States. But I think what lingers most in the minds of participants from the 60s, and what appeals to young people nowadays who take courses and write term papers about the 60s, is the simple notion that the active involvement of people is at the heart of what I would call a radical democracy, or radical politics, that what you do makes a difference. This spirit is the opposite of taken for grantedness, of indifference, of cynicism or passivity. I lived in Manhattan for 10 years, and my middle son, Malik, was always worried about homeless people. Were they drunk and scary? Where did they go? What would they eat? Should he offer to share his slice of pizza? What do we teach our children when we teach them to walk by a woman sleeping in a doorway? What possible set of values do they learn? The closing lines of the Port Huron Statement, written in 1962 primarily by Tom Hayden and adopted as the founding document of SDS, says, "If we appear to seek the unattainable, as it has been said, then let it be known that we do so to avoid the unimaginable." This core idea assumes that we are interconnected and responsible. We can bring school children of South Africa and Palestine close to our concerns, not distant. The ideal of participatory democracy does not condescend to villagers in Mexico. It does not assume that parents of public school students in Chicago are not yet ready for the responsibility of school governance. When widespread discourse and debate was engendered about the history, geography, about U.S. course in Vietnam, people educated themselves about history, geography, international affairs, and recaptured the word politics from the mire. Ordinary people can grasp and debate complex ideas and relationships, can self-educate. Workers in the shipyard of Gdansk, students in China today, create islands of hope and decency as they remake the engaged democratic community through their involvement with the world. We can collectively understand the world. Docility and resignation support the status quo. Who can fail to be outraged by acid rain, exporting nuclear waste to Africa, the fact of 10,000 homeless children in Chicago, the arrest of the film Cry Freedom by the South African government, by deniability? We all have a drive to be free, to be connected to others, to recognize that many of us are non-poor because someone else is poor. We create ourselves not by choosing lifestyles, but by engagement with a resistant world. In that sense, I was blessed to come of age in a time of great social upheaval, to take some liberties with what Oliver Wendell Holmes once wrote by changing the gender. A woman must share the actions and passions of her times, at peril of being judged not to have lived.
Biography is not. Martha Norman, the 1960s, was a member of SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, at Ann Arbor University of Michigan. Currently, she teaches at University of Michigan part-time Afro-American history, and she's also a graduate student. Sorry, I don't have much more of a biography than that, but I give you Martha Norman.
I just want to add, I was also a member of SDS. What I'd like to do today is start out with a song that comes from the Black church, it comes from slavery, it comes from an Old Testament image, a vision, the Old Testament, a vision of promise of progress and promise of blessings to all the families of the earth. I learned the song probably the same way you did in summer camp, and then I relearned the song in Albany, Georgia when I went there in 1963. And I'd like to share the song with you. It's kind of complicated. It starts out with a call and response, and then it's unified at the end. I'll try to sing both parts on the first verse, and then maybe you can do the response as we go through. It starts out, we are climbing Jacob's ladder, and this time you say, ladder, we are climbing Jacob's ladder, ladder, we are climbing Jacob's ladder. Oh, and I'm a soldier of the cross. Every round goes higher. Someone might change it to this basic political question that was being asked at that time. Children, do you want your freedom? Children, do you want your The response would be positive. Say, yes, I think I'll be a soldier. Yes, I think I'll be a soldier, soldier. Yes, I think I'll be a oh, and I'm a soldier of the I want to start with that song and entitle my presentation Soldiers for Justice, the interconnectedness of 60s activism, and I'll sort of go ahead with my presentation. I'm going to pick up really and repeat some of the things that have already been said. To me, the first problem in drawing lessons from the 60s is that we have to get some accurate idea of just what happened in those years. And at this point, I don't think the popular notions of that period or most scholarly treatments are at all helpful. Over the past month, I've been talking about how poorly scholars treat the early years of the civil rights movement. We know if they have problems with coming to grips with that history, and also with someone like Dr. King, that there will be even more difficulty in coming to grips with the later years of SNCC and the story of SDS. The essential problem is the same, however, that in order to take the real lessons out of this history, in order to take away, what they want to do is to take the real lessons out of this history, to take away our history's bite, to declaw it, to defang it. They view the history through the narrowest and most superficial perspective, and so it becomes a linear, one-dimensional thing, something without depth, without breadth, without color, without richness. It becomes something very static and dull, rather than dynamic and forceful. The role of students in this history, I think, is particularly obscured, even in their own history. Students act at worst out of some kind of adolescent hippie rebelliousness, and at best, out of some kind of romantic, starry-eyed idealism. If we approach this history with some kind of seriousness, some kind of depth, we get a totally different picture. And what I'd like to do here today is to just do a little bit of that in order to get some of the lessons that might be derived from this period. And I've been working with this stuff a number of years, but I'm still kind of formulating and thinking, and so I really appreciate reactions. To begin with, we need to establish the origins of the student movement, at least in the 1950s. You've been told that there really wasn't much happening during these years. Now, that may have been true on a lot of college campuses, but why restrict our visions to ivory-covered halls? If we just take a quick glance at the historical landscape at that time, we will see that this movement had some deep and important underpinnings, that it did not spring full-blown from the fluctuating psyche of adolescence. In the broadest sense, the roots of the white student movement, like those of the black student movement, are firmly planted in third world movements for decolonization and liberation. In the Vietnamese ejecting the French, in the Egyptians taking control of the Suez Canal, in the Algerian struggle, in the Mau Mau uprising, in Nkrumah's successful use of civil disobedience techniques to win Ghanaian independence. Nothing was happening in the 50s. These are just a few of the movements that gave reality to the possibility of fairly abrupt, widespread, perhaps even revolutionary and definitely successful political change. At home, black citizens of Montgomery, Alabama waged their own 13-month campaign of civil disobedience, responding immediately, in total unity, to some hastily printed leaflets, and I love these leaflets. You know, we used to mimeograph in those days. And those leaflets that went out were dinky. People paid attention. This community's actions opened up the possibility of another level of civil rights activism. Out of their efforts, their solidarity, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was formed, a nearly defunct CORE was revitalized, and CORE strategists like A. Philip Randolph, who had tried to build a black mass movement based on nonviolent direct action in the 50s, saw the opportunity to move again. We tend to think
that it was organizations and leadership that put the Southern black community in motion. The history suggests that to a large extent, it was this community that put their leadership and their organizations in motion. If Montgomery's black citizens opened up the possibilities of sustained mass action, of movements using civil disobedience, Tennessee sharecroppers presented not just a willingness, but an anxiousness to struggle on a very high level. They went down to register to vote in the late 50s, knowing there was only a slim chance that they would actually be registered, and that there was every chance that they would lose their livelihood and be physically harassed. But they went anyway, letting movement strategists know that rural Southern black people were ready to literally go for broke on the slim possibility of gaining their rights. And as has already been mentioned, all through the 50s, black parents and children struggled over the issue of school desegregation, pressing case after case, both before and after Brown, to ensure the benefits of a more equal education to their community. Their efforts left us with the image of a lone black student or small groups of black students from kindergarten age through college, facing huge white mobs to go through school. This indelibly printed on our minds the possibility of youth successfully challenging the status quo. 60 students then entered a politically charged historical scene. Conscious or not, they were the beneficiaries and the products of 50s possibilities and experiences, and they began their struggle on a higher level, on another rung of the social movement ladder as a result. Sometimes their contacts with 50s histories was more than something in the air, something blowing in the wind, something talked about at the dinner table when the TV news went, and we were the first TV news generation. The relationship with the 50s could often be quite direct. Ann Arbor SDS students traveled more than once to Fayette to bring food and supplies to aspiring black voters who had been kicked off their land. And denied welfare. Paul Brooks and Jim Foreman, who later became SNCC workers, also made this journey from Chicago. In another arena, Jim Foreman studied with St. Clair Drake, who'd been a member of a London group of Pan-Africanists involved in developing decolonization philosophies and strategies, along with African students like Kwame Nkrumah and Jomo Kenyatta. You probably already have an image of black students who were involved, and the white students too, in the civil rights movement as brave and courageous. And you know they were involved in things like sit-ins, Freedom Rides, Mississippi Freedom Summer. But that doesn't tell you what these students contributed to raising struggle to another level, to climbing up another rung of the social movement ladder. Let me just briefly summarize it. Black students emerging from the 50s brought with them an historical sense of immediacy, that this was the time to act, to move. You hear it in the slogan, Freedom Now. You hear it in their song, There Ain't But One Thing We Did Right, was the day we started to fight. SNCC chairman in the early 60s, Chuck McDew, had as his standard speaking line, "We are going to make more changes in the next 5 years than you've seen in the last 50. Drawing from this sense of the immediate potential for change, these students quickened the pace of struggle. First, with their part-time activities, February 1st, 1960, the Greensboro sit-ins. You know, if you look at the pace of activities, civil rights activities during the 1950s, it's a slow kind of thing. It's a bus boycott here, a boycott there, a protest here, a national demonstration there. After February 1st, 1960, there are sit-ins in hundreds of cities across the South. The sit-ins are followed by the Freedom Rides, and Freedom Rides is followed by Freedom Rides. There's something going on in civil rights activities all the time once the students get involved. So they quicken the pace of struggle by these activities. They further quicken the pace of struggle by by dropping out of school, working full-time, forming a South-wide organization, and thus created, just when they started, with 16 workers, the largest field staff of any existing civil rights group. Students also made contributions to keeping movement momentum going by creating and supporting a wide range of activities: desegregation efforts, voter registration campaigns, freedom schools, cooperative efforts, trade union organizing, and so on. There's so many of these activities that there's no history at this point that covers a range of student activities and projects directly connected to SNCC. Students also demonstrated their willingness to struggle on a serious level and thus raising the level on which civil rights struggle was conducted in this country. They showed they were willing to confront racism, to do it on a level where there was certain arrests, probable beating, and probable killings. That is, that they were willing to risk life and limb. And for the first time, civil rights organizations were then able to plan strategy on this assumption that people were going to put, these were going to be the terms of participation. But I think the most important thing that students did in this issue of raising the level of struggle was that they left their campuses and linked themselves to the struggle of rural Southern Black communities who were also willing to struggle on this level. And in this sense, we tapped the strength that was the thing that really kept the civil rights movement going. And what I think is important to remember about this was a conscious decision on the part of Black students to push history to its limits, to get the most out of the historical opportunity as was possible. We talked in the 60s, in the early 60s, about going into the Black Belt because it was the area where there was the greatest potential for power, because of the numbers of Black people in the Black Belt. And then, of course, that there was a potential for, not just for political power, but for all kinds of power. These people could be brought together to move in their self-interest. And we call what we were doing creating vehicles of power in the early 60s. We also had an image, of course, that if these people came into the political system, it would liberalize all of American politics, because it was the senators and the congressmen from these very districts who were the most conservative and the most powerful ones in Congress, and then, holding back any kind of liberal legislation. We also consciously talked about entering these communities so that the civil rights movement would be radicalized by being forced to address the needs of the most oppressed. And that if that happened, their needs would be met and the movement itself would be radicalized. So we moved as a conscious vanguard, pushing history. I think in return, it grounded us in the suffering that was caused by racial oppression. And when you hear this sense of moral outrage, I think from SNCC, or when people talk about the SNCC mystique, it seems to me it's quite clear. It is that we knew the kind of damage that oppression caused. Now, I hope at this point you can see where I'm going. White students in turn then entered their activism on a higher level, having witnessed the achievement of Black students. They began confident, having the knowledge that students could play a major and significant role in making social change. Again, often with direct experience in the civil rights movement, Mario Savio, Berkeley, Mississippi Green, everybody that's spoken here. White students then pushed for changes in campus policy, which often involved clearing Black neighborhoods to make way for university buildings, went to Black and white communities to organize and stage some protests against U.S. foreign policy, most especially in Vietnam and Cuba. The Black community enters this dynamic again, climbing up beyond the rung of protest and beyond directed civil disobedience. The community rose up and said, we are going to bring everything to a halt. There's not going to be any business as usual. This exploitation of our community has to stop. Just try and start another incident of police brutality. Try and insult us while you're taking our money, and just watch what happens. And the cities went up in smoke. And instead of children facing fire hoses and snarling dogs, you see young men and women throwing pop bottles at tanks. These movements fed off and contributed to one another and kept things going higher and higher. Wasn't that what Jimi Hendrix was singing? Let me take you higher. In the meantime, Black students working off of their own experience of hard struggle in the South, reacting to urban uprisings, and widening their international vision, put forth a slogan that galvanized the country, taking social action to yet another level with Black power. Following it with another slogan, stressing, actually glorying in the urban rebellion as positive forces for making change. As Rat Brown would be say, burn, baby, burn. Now, we can't let historians define the black student movement in these years as separatist, as a thing of sort of turning in on itself, because exactly the opposite was happening here. Black students were expanding, were reaching out beyond the rural South to pockets of black populations in urban cities, indeed to black revolutionary movements in Africa. They went further than that, building links at the same period, building links to other third world struggles to support the Cuban Revolution, Puerto Rican and Hispanic solidarity, as well as to the denunciation of Zionism and support of the PLO. And this latter position was in direct response to trying to forge links in Africa, which we could not do with support of Israel. And of course, the black student movement at this point was reaching out to the white student movement by making what was perhaps an even more forceful denunciation in the draft and the war than the peace activists that had preceded them. What was Stokely Carmichael's response to the draft? Hell no, we will not go. What did SNCC give as its reason for its opposition to the war in Vietnam? The war, we said, is an imperialist, racist, and unjust war. Listen to Cleve Sellers after he refused induction into the United States Army. Cleve said, the central question for us is not whether we allow ourselves to be drafted, because we've resolved that this shall not happen by any means, but rather the central question for us is how do we stop the exploitation of our brothers' territories and goods by a wealthy, hungry nation such as this. And after he cited the natural resources present in countries, he pledged support to his brothers in Vietnam, to those fighting the Iranian government, his brothers in the Congo, South Africa, and Latin America. I think quite clearly this period ought to tell us that we don't have to meet together to struggle together. I think this is further demonstrated as white students respond to the actions of the black community, taking civil disobedience to another level, where thousands pushed for arrest, while hundreds of thousands demonstrated their opposition to the war. Then not an insignificant number of local white student protests end or begin with trashing, efforts to destroy ROTC buildings and draft records and so forth, which, you know, have a kind of a tinge of a riot to them. And I think also after this, white students found it easier to speak against the war in more forceful and revolutionary language. And other students in this period, both black and white, explore the possibility of building on all of this and raise struggle to another level through revolutionary actions. Some, like the Panthers, combine a revolutionary perspective with community organizing. Others consider that they might be able to push this movement for justice at home and abroad along just a little bit faster if they used military tactics. Of course, it wasn't one of the dictator black power by any means necessary. These people go underground, becoming what I like to term radical outlaws. And by this time, struggle had moved to such a high level. There really wasn't a whole lot else to do if you wanted to stay in the vanguard. Now, what the lessons are, I think, that we can come to here is that these movements, the movements of the black community, of black students and white students, are joined. They're intertwined and they're overlapping. Whether there was any direct contact between them or not, everybody involved was a fighter for freedom, a soldier for justice. No one is confused about this. The rioters, the sharecroppers, they talk in terms of freedom and justice. And if there's any confusion or lack of clarity in their language, the level at which they struggled suggests that they knew they were going for something deep and important, because every person that participated in the urban uprising, every person that participated in demonstrations in the South before they walked out the door and said, I'm ready to die right now, and I don't mind if it happens. When you read the history of the black student movement in particular, I don't think you should let anybody tell you, I think as Clay Carson does in his treatment of SNCC, that the students started out with a very limited vision, with a sense that all they wanted to do when they were sitting in was drink a cup of coffee sitting down. When they formed their sitting committees, and the Greensboro students formed their sitting committee. They didn't call themselves the Greensboro students who wanted to have a cup of coffee sitting down. They called themselves the Student Executive Committee for Justice. They knew they were after something large. And I'm even a little bit dissatisfied with my own sense here of Soldiers for Justice, because I think in addition, the thing that united all of these movements was that people were determined not just to witness for justice, not just to stand for justice, but to change the basic political, social terms that govern their lives, to make social change. Another lesson, I think, and I want to put this all together, is to say that all of these techniques worked. All of these techniques created a situation where there was greater and greater potential for making social change. And I think this is a thing that people don't want us to understand about this history. That is, that nice social change efforts worked, and the not so nice social change efforts worked too. Also, I think that history obscures just about how far along we've come by the turn of the decade, how all these issues had indeed been joined, and how the kind of strength and power that that represented, both in the joining of issues and the joining of students with oppressed communities. They saw what kind of effect it had in the early 60s, and they were scared to death of what it might have happened in the early 70s. The next thing is that decision-making was indeed being made in the streets. If we read the history of this period today, it looks as though Lyndon Baines Johnson was still in control of his foreign policy, or that John F. Kennedy was carrying the civil rights ball. Obviously, people in the street made Johnson afraid to continue to run again. He couldn't even dictate his own personal career, much less a foreign policy. And of course, it was the civil rights movement that propelled Kennedy along, not vice versa. And if you're confused, just read his civil rights platform in 1960 and look at what was accomplished by 1964 after his death. I think another lesson from this period is that people without the conventional means of power, that it was people without conventional means of power who were formulating, guiding, and making the decisions of the decade. People without money, people without position, people without prestige. Mississippi sharecroppers, Detroit's unemployed, were directing the course of history. And a significant part of this empowered force of the conventionally powerless, of course, were students. Again, I think another thing that we see that is obscured in the reading is that people can and do move out of the motivations of the highest order, out of desire for justice, out of desire for freedom, out of desire for liberty. These are the lessons, I think, of social change that history wants us to bury. And there's another one, and that is that we know, those of us who participated in those years, we know that our country is not innocent, clean, or pure, that her commitment to democracy, to civil rights, to civil liberties is questionable, and that she doesn't play fair. Now, this is something you think might have been settled a long time ago by anyone who just took a brief glance at our history, which began, with seizing the land from the Native Americans, a little trickery, a little genocide, then developing it with a little slavery. Or, we looked at our foreign policy in Latin America, and the Caribbean, and the Philippines. But somehow, we've managed to come through all of that, and the country remains with this image of innocence and good heart, wholeheartedness, fair-heartedness, all those things. But we should have known something different from the beginning, when, as Kwame Ture likes to say now, we had to shed blood to get registered to vote in the good old USA in 1965. And if we were unclear, it was reinforced for us in the late 60s as our leadership was taken from jail to jail on a series of, pretext charges. The same thing with the Panthers. And then, of course, we had all those government agencies surveilling us. But we also know that it got much more vicious than that. we knew something was a little amiss when, as Bernadine mentioned, Daley issued a shoot-to-kill order against black citizens who were trying to end exploitation in their own community. When Panther officers from coast to coast were attacked by policemen with guns drawn and firing. When black students in Orangeburg, South Carolina, posing no threat to the police, were attacked by them. 3 were killed: Henry Smith, Delano Middleton, and Samuel Hammond Jr., and 27 wounded, all of them shot in the back. Feet. Preceding that, one student at Texas Southern was killed when police attacked the dorms there. Of course, we know the 4 students here: Allison Krause, Jeffrey Miller, Senator Schroeder, William Schroeder, and 9 were wounded. 2 weeks later, 2 students again were killed when the police attacked the dormitories at Jackson State College. We know that there is blood on our country's hands, and this is another part of 60s history that people would like to see buried, to be swept under the rug, to be obliterated from the historical landscape. And if you were sitting here, you know I'm right. What did they try? They tried to change the whole topography here, right? Mm-hmm. Build a gym, just wipe it out. But the thing is that it won't work, because they left the wounded, and they left a lot of bystanders. And we can still tell the story. And this story is explosive. I remember in the 60s, the Muslims used to say, you know, when they were passing out issues of Muhammad, selling issues of Muhammad Speaks, they called it passing out bullets. Well, issues of Muhammad Speaks were bullets. The history that we're sitting on is dynamite. Now, I do think we need a monument for our fallen soldiers of justice. I want my children and my grandchildren to go somewhere and weep over these names and touch the letters of those who gave their lives for justice, like Herbert Lee and Sammy Young, who was shot down on Southern Roads. I want names there for the scores of people protesting their community's exploitations that were killed by police and National Guards and urban uprisings. I want to see the name of slain Panthers like Fred Hampton, and the names of the weather people like Diane Martin. And I want to see these names linked in memoriam to the Kent State students and the Jackson State students. I want to see them linked in our memories that they were linked in struggle. But more than a monument, we need to keep making soldiers. We need to maintain our commitment to struggle, to keep climbing up the ladder of social justice. I think Bernice Reagan, Sweet Honey, sings the song, "We freedom cannot rest." To end this, I want to come back to the church again, back to another song that we pressed in political service. I used this last year, the Union of SNCC Activists. The chorus goes, "We are soldiers in the army. We have to fight, although we have to cry. We have to hold up the bloodstained banner. We have to hold it up until we win." Now there's a verse that I think that matters to all of us. And I hope that we'll be able to use that verse, to use it to testify to our own continuing activism, that whenever we come together, this year, next year, 5 years from now, 20 years from now. And the verse goes like this: I'm so glad I'm a soldier. I have my hand on the freedom flag. One day, I'll get old and can't fight anymore. But I'll stand here and fight on anyhow. My brothers and sisters in struggle, please fight on.
next speaker, by the way, wonderful speech, is Carl Oglesby. He is the son of an active rubber worker. He attended Kent State in the mid-1950s and later entered the University of Michigan, where he joined SDS. Chosen to serve on the 8-member National Interim Committee 1964-69, Carl was elected SDS president a year later. During his term, he traveled to North Vietnam. In 1967, Oglesby authored the influential study on imperialism called Containment and Change. Having taught at Antioch, Dartmouth, and Massachusetts Institute of Technology, he is now a freelance writer and lecturer living in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Where's Carl at? Is he here? Oh, Carl Oglesby.
I'm among several who were confused a little confused as to the precise nature of this session. I thought that we were going to have a little panel and talk about how come we broke up. I like what has happened instead of that. I love the speeches that have been given so far. And, I would like to pay the greatest honor to them by sitting down and shutting up because they're...
No!
Well, in that case, are there any questions, observations, comments? I have always been intimidated by SDS crowds. Yes, long time ago, somebody wrote an article, I think it was in the National Guardian, about one of our dues, I think it was in NC, Illinois, in probably 1966. And since I was at that point an officer of the thing, and didn't say one word in a whole 3-day meeting, this was speculated upon, I think by Jack Smith in the National Guardian. And he said that he thought it must be because I was just trying to give space to the younger people and bring them on out and, not, be a good guy, shut up and let other people talk for a while. Well, it wasn't it. I was terrified. Yeah, I was intimidated by, for one thing, the level of dialogue. You don't find SDS kind of people around every telephone pole. What this organization brought together, it seems to me, was a kind of miracle. I don't know quite where it came from. I don't know that the country really deserved it. But there it is. And I think another reason why I've always had trouble talking inside SDS is that the dialogue within is, for very good reasons, largely concentrated on who we are, how we got here, and what we're supposed to do. Whereas the dialogue without has to do with the attack on imperialism, the attack on racism, the attack on the failure of our national values in front of an audience that doesn't know yet, presumably, that racism is bad, that the war is bad, that imperialism is bad. And in a sense, that was the easy part of what the movement was about. Not in every sense, because we were at war over those issues. We were in deep conflict with people who had passionately held ideas to the contrary about us. And yet, to talk about the war was, I thought, always easier. To debate the war, to debate the question of American social values, the fabric of our society, before people who had not yet made up their minds about which way to go. That always seemed to me the easiest part of it. And the hard part of it came when you gathered together a community of people who shared values, who shared a sense of what was wrong, and who wanted to join together with one another to do something about it. Then the question was, well, who are we after all? And on what basis do we stand when we propose our criticisms? And what do we want instead? And if we can define what we want instead, how do we go about pursuing it? And in the space, instead of the consensus about the larger issues, instead of the consensus about what generally we ought to be doing and what generally we're about, the dialogue would change to a very difficult and often bitter argument about who we were and what we should do and how we should go about doing it and what was our relationship to other social change agencies. And that was the conversation that I always found exceedingly difficult. Trying on one's patience sometimes, and other times confronting one with a level of, with a need for a level of analysis that few of us were accustomed to, and that we had, I think, we had no tradition. We had no habit, we had no institutionalized way of talking about things like that. If you joined a group, generally speaking, the group had a constitution, it had articles of faith. You subscribed to those articles and you knew what you were supposed to do. SDS wasn't like that. There was a statement of values. Certainly the Port Huron statement went a long way towards applying that. And we had some basic ideas about who we were. But for a variety of reasons, it was always difficult to find out how those things added up or developed out into a clear-cut strategic requirement or a sense of, a clear-cut sense of what we had to do. In other words, it was externally that we were unified, that we were brought generally together around some very powerful, simple ideas about what we were about, what we were looking for, what we wanted to do. Stop the war. End racism. Open up the educational process. Fine. We had that debate. I think we did well with that debate. I think overall, until late in the 60s, the movement had that debate won. Not that we lost it thereafter, but that we lost the means to secure victory, at least for a while. And maybe forever. If their victory was secured, it was not by SDS. It was not by SNCC. It was by different kinds of organizations, fragments of organizations, individuals, that the rewards of the struggle were to be reaped. And this created a great difficulty. It meant that there was an enormous lapse, a breaking of continuity at the end of the 1960s, just at the moment, I think, when we had thought we were really getting someplace. I sat out on the lawn on Thursday, that I thought the key thing about 1968 was that when we went into that year, we had a victory. The movement against the war certainly had made real progress in turning around opinion in the United States, as well as in the government. We got rid of Johnson. He had to say he'd stop the war. He had to say he would stop the bombing. He had to say he would set up peace talks. He had to say he wouldn't run anymore. And all of that, I think, comes off the kinds of energy and the kinds of critique, the kinds of ideas that were injected into American political life by the movement. But then things got tough. Our leaders got shot away. There was an implicit coalition between Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King at a certain point in 1968. That coalition was not only social in nature, not only movemental in certain of its aspects, it was also, in a sense, regular and conventional, and it had some real hope of gaining power within the conventional system. And within the conventional system, it had some hope of stopping the war, moving ahead on the question of racism, and opening up educational life in the country. Without those possibilities, without the possibility of translating a democratic participatory movement into victories within the electoral system, the movement was forced to find another footing for itself. It was forced to find another foundation. It couldn't simply look anymore to changes in the electoral process or through the electoral process, because it had been impressed upon us that if we did manage to succeed so far, that we could establish a real threat through the conventional political process, then we would face sterner and stiffer repression. If we got so far as to have the possibility of winning power at the presidential executive level, at the congressional level, then the bayonets, the guns would come out, and we would learn what were the limits. We would be taught, thus far canst thou go, no further. And at that point, the movement would either have to scatter and abandon its objectives, or it would have to find some other concept of what it was about, some other sense of what the change process was, and how we, students for the most part, how we could enter into that process and affect it. And I think it was at that time that the idea of revolution, which I believe had been present in the movement essentially as a metaphor in the period before, and maybe somebody else would want to say that only means it wasn't a very well worked out idea, which is just kind of a hazy notion that we should change and change fundamentally. But after 1968, it wasn't any good anymore to see or to think of revolution as a metaphor. There was a need to think in more concrete terms. And that got us into the question more deeply of who we were to talk about revolution. Were we silly? Was it crazy for us to do this? Were we like King Canute trying to put the ocean in a little hole? Or was there something about who we were? Was there something about the gathering of students that gave us some realistic permission to hope that our pressures against the society could result in the kinds of changes that we wanted, in a positive improvement of the lives of the people in this country and the world? So an enormous debate ensued. Some people argued, well, all the positions, all the possible positions were argued. I suppose at one poll there was the sense that students as such are worthless as change agents. They don't belong to any really discernible class except sort of the sloppy middle and the big old middle class. What use does it have in social change? On the contrary, it's threatened by the prospects of social change. On another side, there was, as Carl mentioned, there was a good deal of theorizing about the new working class, the sense that students were not just trivial, inconsequential members of the society, but rather that they belonged to, were a part of the formation of a new proletariat, a techno-proletariat, people whose intellectual command over the machinery of production was becoming so critical, so important to the production process as a whole, that group had power in the society as a whole. That concept, whether it was true or not, for a moment at least gave us a sense that we were not simply irrelevant students, not simply overbred brats of a middle class looking for adventures. We were, on the contrary, people upon whom the society would increasingly come to depend as the process of modern production continued to evolve. And the debate between these sides was a never-ending debate. I don't think it's ended now. I don't think it will be ended for a long time. And in the end, I suppose the justification for having the debate is not that at the end you will solve the question and know the answer. The justification for having the debate is that it is the debate of our times. It is the debate of our identities. It is the debate that takes us to the center of the mystery of who we are, of what our country is, of what history is about. The mystery, I say. And I think that we cannot dispel these mysteries, but have to live with these mysteries in daily communion with them. And if we ever come to know who we are, it will be primarily through the process of looking back to see what we did. Maybe after a while, we will be able to look back and say, look what the student movement did. This was the trumpet blast preluding the emergence of a new powerful class in history that would finally be able to understand the needs of society as a whole. that would finally be able to put first the interests of the society as such, and not the interests of a dominant class within that society or a dominant race. Whether or not that really can happen, whether or not it is still continuing to happen even in the relative quiescence of the last few years, is, I would say, a mystery still. I have no way to settle that mystery. I involve myself in the debate like everybody else because it's there, but I don't like it. To me, it's difficult. The material is slippery. It's hard to pin anything down. I would rather go out and debate the Vietnam War than who we were. I would rather go out and say, you got to integrate the society or it's going to collapse and fall apart, rather than say, who are we as the change agents to try to bring that about? On those first set of questions, what should America do? What should America be? I think we had a powerful, burning, passionate consensus that we were able to take to the people, and that woke the people up and got them alive to the possibility of politics as a way, politics as a vocation, politics as a way through the problems that we face. But on the question of, were we revolutionaries? Were we reformers? Were we bourgeoisie? Were we proletarian? Were we something different from all these things? In this area, mystery, it seems to me, is going to rule for a very long time. And since, in a sense, that's the question today, I start out flustered and not knowing quite what to say. It seems to me, I'm driven to anecdote. There are just I hate to take recourse to it, but one anecdote that I suppose the woman. I don't know what Margaret is talking about. Because he can tell his story. Women in talent. What I remember about a story about the beginning of the movement, and I agree with Martha. You really have to look to the 50s to understand the 60s, and I think in particular you have to look to Kent State University, because I think it started here. I think it started in 1955-56. I used to work when I was a student here down at a place called Sam's Pizza Shop on Franklin Street. It's all bricked up now. I know they had to shut it down because it was a hotbed of radical activity. That was the Home Fellows from which the movement proceeded.
Yeah, right on, right on.
It was at the tables of Sam Catalano's Pizza Shop that several dozen students in those days put together the first racially integrated kind of club that I think had ever been on this campus. I don't know what had happened on other campuses, but we were bothered about racism here. We were bothered about the indifference of campus officialdom. We were bothered about the apathy of the students. I think mostly we saw that from a literary standpoint, and we identified more with Jack Kerouac than with Karl Marx. We looked to the beatniks rather than to the rebels as exemplary people who were showing us a way to move outside the great American neon noon and find some freedom and space at night, in the great American night extolled by Moriarty and Kerouac. That was the beginning, I think, of the search for freedom. We went to midnight. We went down to midnight. We started to meet when everybody else was asleep. We opened our doors when the other doors were closed. And we said, who are we? What are students? What's the matter with our campus? What's the matter with our cities and towns? What can we do? It was trivial and childish of us, I suppose, to do this, but we, in our weakness, our youth, our inexperience, we came to the conclusion that maybe one of the problems was the Greek system. Maybe one of the problems we had fraternities and sororities. The Greeks. Well, let's think about the Greeks. What problem did the Greeks have? The Greeks had a big problem with the Macedonians, if you recall. And so, down at Sam's Pizza Shop, sometime in late 55, early 56, there was formed the Macedonians. We named Don Thompson. We had a Wrighton brother, that was me. We were an integrated group. We started talking about racism on the campus. We challenged the Greek system on that basis. And we did some silly things too. I suppose there are some Greek trophies that I could still go dig up. But it didn't really go much further than that. We all graduated or dropped out and went off to do other things, and I don't think that the Macedonian flag, or whatever you would call it, flew on much longer. It would come back, the spirit would come back. I think that it's interesting that in the mid-1950s, absolutely cut off from any kind of cultural influence in the world, except in the classrooms, we Kent students, black and white together, were able to see that a new time was coming, a new mental set was required, a new way of looking at the world, a new way of thinking about one's own responsibility in the world. The Macedonians. Well, the Macedonians, the spirit of the Macedonians moved throughout the land after that point on little cat feet. And pretty soon we had this thing, SDS, moving out of a defunct and used up organization called the Student League for Industrial Democracy, associated with the LID. Not a bad bunch of book writers, but that was about what the LID was. And SLID was at that point just a debating society. Praise to the genius and to the passion of the students who came along in the late 50s, early 60s, and started to think that, hey, there's something better than a debating society, something more important for us, for the students of this generation. And that spirit, the spirit of the Macedonians, as I would say, the spirit of the Kent State Macedonians resurfaced again. And that time for good in the movement that was led by Students for a Democratic Society. So I think that Kent is really a beginning of a kind of a beginning, maybe you would say a false start, but a real start towards groping for the values that would move the generation of the 60s. Groping for a definition of the problems that we needed to devote ourselves to. And as I think every speaker so far has brought out eloquently, we had a time. We did something that nobody thought could be done. We created a student movement that is without parallel for its duration in American history, for its size, for its scope, for the scale of its concerns, and for its integrity. Over a broad span of years, there's never been anything like that. I don't think there's ever been anything like that in European history. We will see better, but boy, that was a good one. And we made it, so far as we knew, out of nothing. We made it without a tradition to work with. We made it without fathers and mothers who had been there before us and who could tell us something about the beatitudes of the barricades. We had to discover this and make it up ourselves. And that was the good thing about us, but there was a bad thing about that too. We were inexperienced and naive. We were uneducated in the traditions of social thought that could have helped us out. We had no allies in the society. The traditional power of social progress, the trade union movement, coughed out in our period, was negative generally with respect to civil rights and the problems of overcoming racism, was very negative about our critique of the Vietnam War. And I think in some large measure we had real cause to feel that we were strange and new in American history, that there were no precursors for us. We found out later that there were, and you just found out today about the Macedonians. But generally speaking, I think it was true that we emerged in what seemed a vacuum, what seemed a night, what seemed a place without tradition or values that applied to us and that would help us inform our purposes. And so we did make some mistakes. And when the pressure got high, the mistakes were fatal sometimes. Fatal for individuals, and I think ultimately fatal for the organization. Somehow there's another place to talk about the role of our ideas in this. In a way, I would like to say, look, we got crushed by the Marxism that we picked up and tried to use. We too quickly thought we understood how to analyze a hyper-modern industrial society. We too quickly came to the conclusion that the classes were these, those, and the other, and each class had its assigned part. We objectified the world that we were trying to cope with. We deprived it of its subjectivity by our attempts at philosophical orientation and self-definition. What I want to go to, instead of getting into that now, it would be good to get into that, but maybe the energy level is a little different at this point. And we can save that discussion for another moment, another time. Maybe it has to take place in another venue. A discussion of the relevance or irrelevance of the Marxist, Leninist, whatever tradition for the movement that emerged in the United States or in the West in the 1960s. Personally, I think it was a big problem. Personally, I think we did better before we became Marxists. I think that once we became Marxists, we started to founder. We lost our spontaneity. We lost our ability to not give a damn about who we were and to concentrate instead on what we wanted to be. We started thinking of ourselves as objects, and we got lost in the mysteries of objectification. And there was one way in which this showed up in my life, in a very powerful and wrenching respect. It was, in certain respect, it wasn't the end of my relationship to the movement, but it did spell the end of my confidence in certain kinds of organized movemental activity. It was a pattern that had started already in SDS. We began with the idea that participatory democracy was plenty, that you could just come down on that, and if there were any ideological questions that needed to be solved, they could be tended to within the canopy of participatory democracy and free exchange of ideas. But what we would be secure about, what we would all believe in, was that people must be involved in making the decisions that affect their lives. Anybody remember that phrase? People should be involved in making the decisions that affect their lives. What a powerful and simple idea, and who could say no to it? And once you've got the assent, yes, people should be involved in making the decisions that affect. Why not? How could they not be? They must be, sure. And once you had achieved that level of assent, then the gates were open and you were home free. Now, look at the Vietnam War. Did you decide to go to Vietnam? Did you decide to send your kids over there? Good God, you didn't have anything to say about it. You call yourself an American, a free citizen, nobody cares what you think. Your government is fooling you 10 times a day. And you sit there and think, hey, this is the greatest country in the world. We need to go out and tell other people, make other people be like that. The question, the simple question of democratic process exposed the entire system to a full level of practical, powerful, immediate, personal critique that involved everybody immediately in the debate about how things are and how they should be. And we were strong when that's what we were saying. We were strong when we came out and said, hey, you should get involved in making the decision about the Vietnam War. That was the lever that opened people's minds to new ideas. But when we started saying, you are the new working class, well, people would shuffle and say, am I new working class? I want to go write poetry. Does that make me a worker? I felt like I started out working class. My father was lucky to get that far. He was born the first of 13 kids to a South Carolina cotton farmer. My mother was a hillbilly from Georgia. The only reason they ever got up to working class Akron, Ohio was that the farm system failed in the 1920s. And my old man was kicked out of the nest and told to get up north, get a factory job where he could send some money back home and the farm could make it through. That's how he got to be working class. My mother left Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia area where she'd grown up because there was nothing there. It was economically dead. There was no hope. her town in Tennessee. She was born in a town in Tennessee called No Business. It's still there. You can go through it. No Business, Tennessee. That's where she came from. So No Business, Tennessee, and Cowpen, South Carolina, got squeezed up to Tire Town and met each other, fell in love, and I got born to be the son of a rubber worker. I have 70 cousins in my family. Bernadine mentioned that she was the first of her family to go to college. I was the only one of those kids to see the inside of a college, except for one female cousin who was chasing a guy and went to Ole Miss. And when it was all set and fixed up and she had the ring and the ceremony, that's all she wanted to do with college. And I can't blame her for that. Nobody ever told her that she needed an education to understand her world. That wasn't part of that tradition. Nobody ever told me that either. When I said I wanted to go to school, my father said, "What's the matter with you? Haven't you been to school enough?" He had 2 or 3 years. He learned how to read, how to write. What else did you need? He could do a little adding and subtraction. Why bother your mind with all that other silly stuff? Get out, get your job, get a car, get married, start your life. That was his idea. I had one of the first big and most difficult fights I had to go through. In the process of my growing up was the fight about whether I should go to college. And I wouldn't have been able to do it. Even at Kent State, I was able to get a scholarship because I was a debater in high school. But man, that tuition, $35 a quarter? What the heck, that? Well, SDS people began to think they knew better. They began to think that they knew what class we were and what was our destiny and what we ought to do. And at a certain point after the great crisis of '68, and when it was clear that we were not going to be permitted to win an easy legal victory, more and more, the best of us, in most cases, started thinking, well, if it's going to take violence, how do we get organized? If it's going to take blood, whose blood should it be? And how do we think about spilling it? I went through a big, awful fight with the Weathermen, with whom personally I was very close. No point in naming names, but many of the leadership of the Weatherman group were intimate friends of myself and my wife, Beth. A couple of them had been involved in setting up free school projects in Ann Arbor that my kids went to. There was a lot of love between my family and the weather people to be. And I think the love stayed there, but the difficulties came. When the Weathermen decided, as I heard them, after 1968, that there was no longer any reason to suppose that debate was going to get anywhere. The legal system had exposed its inner weakness, its fallibility, its corruption, had exposed the fact that above all, it was controlled by a power elite which would be glad to pretend to share power, but would never actually share. Would pull the carrot back if the horse ever started to take a real bite. So this way of thinking about things, which was very much encouraged by the events that we were looking at, by the experiences we were going through, became dominant in the leadership group in SDS at a moment when people like myself who had a different orientation seemed to have been refuted by the events themselves. In other words, it may have looked as if a guy like me and the other people, many dozens and hundreds of other people who were carrying the word about the war out to the great American debating places, it may have looked up until '68 as if we could actually secure a victory through that kind of politics. But after 1968, the message seemed to be, you will be allowed to go so far in your pretensions of having political power, but if you ever get to the place where you're knocking on the door of the inner chamber, forget it, kid. Or just forget it. And we, the state, will come down on you with whatever we have to do. Just as they were putting those pellet bombs up against the Vietnamese people. with phosphor in them, by the way. I had a detail in 1967. I was a part of the Bertrand Russell Jean-Paul Sartre International War Crimes Tribunal. And one of the most awful sessions I ever sat through in my life, just morally terrifying, was a session in which the Vietnamese made a presentation of the kind of weapons that were being thrown against them. And one of the weapons that they talked about and exhibited was the system of guava bombs, as they call them sometimes, the pellet bombs that Carl Davidson described. The big old thing that would pop open in the air, and all these little baseball-sized bomblets with flanges to spin them up, get them circulating, so that they would hit in the right orientation. And when they hit in the right orientation, they'd blow those pellets out sideways like this to get as many people as they could. That's what they were. They had phosphorus. And we saw victims of the phosphor bombs. The thing about the phosphor, it would get in the skin and get down in the flesh, and you couldn't get it out. There wasn't a medicine. There wasn't a practice that told you how to deal with this. The Vietnamese doctors were at a loss. How do you treat wounds with these pellets that are coated with phosphor? They had victims there who had been hit months and months before they ever came to Stockholm or to Denmark to show the rest of us what it was like. And there was still smoke coming out of this little girl's forearm from a phosphor pellet out of one of those bombs, and they didn't know how to get out. She was doctored during that time, but she had to come to Paris for it. The Vietnamese didn't have the way to deal with this. Nor would these bombs kill people. They very often didn't kill anybody. And that was the trick of it. You don't want to kill them. The dead ones they can just bury. The ones that are hurt, they got to take care of. Every one person hurt, that ties down 10, 20 other people to get them to a hospital, to care for them in a hospital. It ties down resources that have to be dedicated to that need. So we began to have our eyes cleared. We saw the extent to which the philosophers of war would go to secure their objectives. We were nauseated, we were appalled, and we were ashamed to be American. Ashamed to be white. Ashamed of our affluence. Ashamed of almost our education. Ashamed of our advantages. And convinced above all that if we dared think of ourselves as moral people, never mind as agents of social change, we needed to move past everything that made us what we were. We needed to pick up the gun. I had kind of burnout over the debate with the weather folks. I went off to be by myself after 4 or 5, well, more like 4 years of pretty constant being in the movement, being in motion, trying to tend to business. And I found myself in a sort of a movemental funny farm up in Putney, Vermont, which later on was called the Red Clover. It became a kind of commune. It was owned by one of the rich kids in the movement who was a filmmaker associated with the New York Newsreel group. He had fitted out one room as an editing facility, and there was a screening room there in what had once been a big old barn. And there were a lot of people flowing through that place, coming out from the city for a weekend of rest and recuperation. And then there were maybe 8 or 9 of us who lived there at any one time, more or less regularly. And it was a good place. We had good relationships with the surrounding community. We were teaching a class in the screening room, a Thursday night class. 200-300 people would come from all around that area of New England. We had good relations with the local college. We were building an SDS chapter there. And in the village of Putney. You couldn't say that they opened their arms and welcomed us as saviors, but they were friendly and they knew what we were about, and that was all right. Those guys lived up on the farm and they thought about making America a more democratic and more just place. Good. It's okay. No problem with that. And then in this period, 69, 71, around in there, a guy in particular, I'll call him Bob, and I don't mean to fault him, he was just carrying the message. It was coming up from the city. It was coming up from the big impassioned meetings where people were trying to figure out now what do you do. And Bob came to the farm, the Red Clover, with the idea that we really had to get past this middle-class democratic hang-up that had held us back for so long. We needed to understand that power grows out of the barrel of a gun, as Mao had told us, and that so long as we middle-class pseudo-revolutionaries had not the courage to deal with that simple, however staggering fact, we might as well resign ourselves to inconsequence forever. We needed to pick up the gun. So Bob found a couple of ridges over behind the house, a nice place to set up a gunnery range. And from somewhere in the city, he acquired 3 or 4 rifles and maybe a half dozen handguns, serious weapons. So these guns came up to Red Clover. And we were all told that if we were serious, we had to learn how to shoot those guns. And I couldn't win the debate with him. I tried. I was too tired. I was tongue-tied. I couldn't think of the arguments together. I wasn't sure myself that I was right. In that period, it did look sometimes as if the whole thing was going to come down. There was nothing in front of us except the wreckage of our society, and if we were at all reasonable and clear-sighted people, we would know that the responsibility to us was to learn how to shoot that gun and shoot it straight and not be afraid of weapons, not be afraid of hurting people, because there are people out there who need to be hurt if you're going to win your objectives. That was the line that came down, and I was flustered and shut up by it. I said, wait a minute, can we do that? What? No, shut up, you're just scared. You're just scared. The weathermen had hit us with some of that. You're just scared, you're scared. Some more anecdotes about that, but I'm going on too long. There we were in Putney, Vermont, picking up the gun, and me trying to say there's got to be an alternative. There's got to be something better than this. The anecdote. The first winter I was there, snowed bad a lot. A guy named Ted and his buddy Philip from the gas station down in town had a pickup truck with a snow plow on it, and they would drive up the road that we lived on, and they would plow people's driveways out, and they plowed our driveways out. They knew who we were. They knew we were from SDS, that we had been in the anti-war movement, all that sort of thing. They drove up there in their pickup trucks, and they plowed our driveway. That was the summer before the guns came, or the winter before the guns came. The winter after the guns came, those same guys came up the same road, came into the same driveway, didn't plow it out, got out their own guns, 30-06s, and put out every window in that place. A pure accident that didn't kill somebody. I thought that we had lost something very important between those 2 winters. We had let impatience compel us to a line of activity that was foreign to our natures and that we didn't know how to do. And we had lost the faith that we had with such difficulty, begun to win from the American people as a whole. I'm not saying that there was no justification for it all. I always will see it as a maybe an all too human response. But unlike Carl, I gotta say, I have some regrets. I have a regret in particular that at that moment I and people who felt like I did were not stronger and were not more articulate as to what the situation called for from us. It demanded that we learn patience beyond our years. It demanded that we realize that we were drawing the kind of heat that we were because we were on the right track. Because nonviolence was a winning strategy. It couldn't be put down, and if we had stayed faithful to that, who knows how that period would have gone. But we broke faith with the fundamental assumptions that brought us into being in the first place. We broke faith with the assumptions of nonviolent participatory democracy. We opted for cadreism. We opted for secrecy. We opted for an underground. When at all times, that was the moment when we needed to be most expressive, when we needed to be fullest, in our desire to maintain a communion with the American people, our families. I think that there is a chance that the student movement is warming up again. It looks good. East to west, north to south. Students are again of a critical mind. Students are again beginning to think they'd be better off, and the country will too, if they get organized and start trying to push some principles. That's good. That's great. I think we're all encouraged by it. We feel magnificent. Where have they been so long? But we should also be able to say, watch it, you may face some of the same problems, some of the same pitfalls, traps, and snares that we ran into. It won't be exactly like what we ran into. History never gives you the same play twice. There's always some cute little change on the inside of it that makes it new. But I think, on the other hand, it is possible for us to say, and it is possible for us to renew a dedication to the principle that nonviolence is the last thing from a passive, weak, supine policy. It is aggressive, it is powerful. It gives you an inroad to the American heart that nothing else can do, that no gun, no bomb can give you. To the student movement that is to come, to the student movement that is starting to form. As an old SDSer, I say, with all the other things that you have to learn patience, learn to stick to your first principles, learn, please, not to be stampeded into violence, however logical, however psychologically necessary it can be made to seem. Because that is always the stampede over the cliff. Nonviolence is the most powerful position that the movement can take. As long as it remains faithful to that, it can never be beaten. As soon as it moves away from that, it can never win.
The way we kind of wanted to go now was have the response panel, but if people want to break, yeah, it's up to you.
What kind of break and how long?
Let me just make a quick announcement. There are a few places to eat lunch here. I'm fairly sure that the Student Center cafeteria is open. That's on the second floor, right below us, and there's also on the first floor, there's a Wendy's. And just for those who don't care. And if you want directions to good vegetarian places in town, you can come see me or Kim or any other local company. And we'll try to get back here, say, by a 1:45. Or quicker.
Bring your food, eat it, get back here.
All right, please remember that we're going to try to take that photo now. Is everyone listening to this, please? We need everyone's cooperation in order to pull this off. We did want to take a group photo, so those people who were in the chapter or around the chapter would like to be included in the photograph. Please remain behind in this room, okay? And we'll bring everyone downstairs, get this taken care of as soon as possible, and then you can fill your stomachs.